She stood at his grave, clutching a letter she'd never get to send. The casket was closed, the flowers were white, and somewhere, miles away, he was watching her cry. He wanted to know if her love was real, so he did the unthinkable. He faked his own death. But when he finally came back, what he discovered didn't just break his heart. It destroyed everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the woman he was about to marry. This is the story of Daniel Cole, a man who had it all: money, success, a beautiful bride waiting at the altar. But beneath the surface, doubt had planted its roots deep in his mind. He'd been burned before, cheated on, lied to. And now, just weeks before his wedding, he couldn't silence the voice in his head that whispered, "What if she's just like the rest? What if the love she claims to feel is nothing more than a performance?" So he devised a plan, a test so extreme, so unthinkable, that it would either prove her devotion or expose the truth he feared most. He would disappear, vanish without a trace. And then, in the shadows, he would watch. But here's the thing about testing people. Sometimes, the test reveals more about you than it does about them. And sometimes, by the time you realize that, it's already too late. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Cole wasn't always this way. Friends who knew him in his 20s described him as confident, charismatic, the kind of guy who could light up a room just by walking into it. He built his wealth from the ground up, starting a tech consulting firm that serviced Fortune 500 companies. By 34, he was living in a penthouse overlooking the city, driving cars most people only see in magazines, and attending charity galas where everyone knew his name. But success, as Daniel learned, doesn't immunize you from pain. His first serious relationship ended when he found his girlfriend in bed with his business partner. The betrayal gutted him. He threw himself into work, building walls around his heart that he swore no one would scale again, until he met Maya Johnson. Maya was different. She wasn't impressed by his money or his status. She was a nurse at a children's hospital, the kind of person who worked double shifts and still found time to volunteer at homeless shelters on weekends. She had this way of looking at people, really looking at them, like she could see past the armor they wore. When Daniel met her at a mutual friend's birthday party, he was captivated. She didn't fawn over him. She challenged him. She asked him questions no one else bothered to ask. What makes you happy? When was the last time you did something just because it felt right, not because it made sense? Within 6 months, they were inseparable. Daniel had never felt this way about anyone. Maya made him believe in love, again. She was patient with his insecurities, understanding when he pulled away, always ready to reassure him that she wasn't going anywhere. And for a while, Daniel believed her. But as the wedding date approached, something shifted. Old wounds started reopening. He'd catch himself scrolling through her phone when she was in the shower, looking for something, anything, that would confirm his worst fears. He'd ask her where she'd been, who she'd been with, analyzing her answers for inconsistencies. Maya noticed, of course. She'd gently confront him, asking what was really going on. And every time, Daniel would apologize, promise to trust her more, swear that he was working on it. But the doubt never left. It grew, festered, until one night, after a few too many drinks with his best friend Leon, Daniel said something that would change everything. "I need to know if she's real, Leon. I need to know if she'd stay if everything fell apart." Leon laughed it off at first, thinking Daniel was just venting. But Daniel wasn't joking. Over the next few weeks, the idea consumed him. What if he could test her? What if he could create a situation so devastating, so final, that only true love could survive it? And that's when he came up with the plan. Daniel spent 2 weeks organizing every detail. He couldn't involve too many people because the risk of exposure was too high, but he needed at least one person he could trust completely. That person was Marcus, a former college roommate who now worked as a private investigator. Marcus had helped Daniel before, during the messy end of his first relationship, digging up evidence of the affair. When Daniel called him with this new request, Marcus was skeptical. You want to fake your own death? Daniel, that's insane. That's illegal. That's Marcus. Daniel interrupted. I need to know. I need to see how she reacts when she thinks I'm gone. If she grieves, if she moves on too quickly, if she's relieved. Marcus went quiet on the other end of the line. After a long pause, he said, If I help you with this, you have to promise me one thing. When it's over, you never contact me again. Whatever happens, you're on your own. Daniel agreed. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Daniel would stage a car accident on a remote stretch of highway about 2 hours outside the city. Marcus would use his connections to file a false police report and have a local coroner issue a preliminary death certificate. The story would be that Daniel lost control of his car during a rainstorm, crashed through a guardrail, and plunged into a ravine. The car would be found burned out, making identification difficult but not impossible. A few personal effects. Daniel's wallet, his watch, would be recovered from the scene. The funeral would happen quickly, before anyone could ask too many questions. Daniel would watch from a distance, disguised, observing Maya's every move. He'd see if she cried real tears or if her grief was just for show. He'd watch how she interacted with his family, whether she'd comfort his mother or retreat into herself. And after a few weeks, once he was satisfied, he'd reveal the truth. He imagined the moment 1,000 times. Her shock, her relief, maybe even her anger. But ultimately, her understanding. She'd realize it was a test, a twisted but necessary confirmation of their bond, and they'd move forward, stronger than ever. That's how it was supposed to go. But here's the thing about plans built on lies. They never survive contact with reality. It was a Thursday night when Daniel disappeared. He'd told Maya he was driving upstate to meet with a potential client, a story that was plausible enough that she didn't question it. He kissed her goodbye at the door, held her a little longer than usual, and then he was gone. The next morning, Maya woke up to 17 missed calls. Her heart dropped before she even looked at the screen. Something was wrong. She called back the first number, a local police station, and the words that came through the phone turned her entire world upside down. Miss Johnson, I'm sorry to inform you that there's been an accident. Daniel Cole was involved in a single vehicle collision last night around 11 p.m. I'm afraid he didn't survive. Maya's phone slipped from her hand. She stood there in the kitchen, frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. Just hours ago, he was standing right here, telling her he'd be back by Sunday. They were supposed to go cake tasting next week. They were supposed to get married in 43 days. The next few days were a blur. Daniel's family flew in from across the country. His mother, Catherine, was inconsolable. She clung to Maya at the funeral home, sobbing into her shoulder, asking over and over how this could have happened. Maya held her, numb, moving through the motions because she didn't know what else to do. The funeral was held on a gray, drizzly Tuesday. The kind of weather that feels like the sky itself is mourning. Over 200 people showed up. Colleagues, friends, people Daniel had mentored over the years. The casket was closed, which the funeral director explained was necessary due to the severity of the burns. Maya stood at the front, staring at the polished wood, trying to convince herself that Daniel was really inside. But she couldn't feel him. It was like he was just gone. And somewhere, less than 50 yards away, standing under a black umbrella with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, Daniel watched. He watched her cry. He watched her clutch a folded piece of paper, a letter she'd written to him that she'd never get to send. He watched his mother collapse into the arms of his brother, her body shaking with grief. And for the first time since he'd conceived this plan, Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Doubt, regret, maybe even shame. But he pushed it down. He needed to see this through. He needed to know. The first week after the funeral, Maya barely left the apartment. Friends brought food she didn't eat. Her mother stayed with her, sleeping on the couch, gently trying to coax her back into the world. But Maya felt like she was underwater, everything muffled and distant. She'd wake up in the middle of the night reaching for Daniel, forgetting for just a moment that he was gone, and then the reality would crash over her again. Daniel, meanwhile, was staying in a motel 40 miles away, monitoring everything through a network of cameras he'd installed in their apartment weeks before. He told himself it was just for the test, just to see how she really behaved when she thought no one was watching. But the truth was, he couldn't let go. He watched her cry herself to sleep. He watched her sit at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. And he watched her, about 10 days after the funeral, finally start to pick up the pieces. Maya went back to work, not because she was ready, but because sitting at home felt like drowning. Her colleagues were gentle with her, giving her the easy shifts, checking in constantly, and slowly, very slowly, she started to resemble herself again. She smiled. She laughed at a coworker's joke. She went to lunch with a friend. To anyone watching, it might have looked like she was moving on. But to Daniel, sitting in that motel room staring at a laptop screen, it looked like betrayal. How could she laugh? How could she go out to lunch? He'd been gone less than 2 weeks. Then, about 3 weeks after the funeral, something happened that made Daniel's blood run cold. Maya came home one evening with a man. Daniel didn't recognize him at first, but after some digging, he learned his name was Eric, a doctor Maya worked with at the hospital. They weren't touching. They weren't even sitting particularly close. Eric had apparently just given her a ride home after her car wouldn't start. But Daniel didn't see it that way. He saw a man in his apartment, in his space, sitting on his couch, talking to his fiancée. That night, Daniel made a decision. It was time to come back. Daniel planned his return carefully. He couldn't just show up at the apartment. He needed to control the environment, the narrative. So he sent Maya a text from a new number, one she wouldn't recognize. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park on Riverside. Tomorrow at noon. Come alone." Maya stared at the message, her stomach twisting. She almost deleted it, almost convinced herself it was spam or some cruel prank. But something about the wording felt familiar. The next day, she went to the park. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that this was probably nothing. But as she approached the bench near the river, she saw him, Daniel, alive, standing there in a jacket she'd never seen before, looking thinner, more tired. But unmistakably him. For a moment, Maya couldn't breathe. Her brain couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. Then the shock turned to something else. Anger. She walked up to him, her hands shaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" Daniel tried to explain. He tried to tell her about the test, about needing to know if her love was real, about his past and his fears and how he just couldn't marry her without being absolutely sure. But with every word, Maya's expression grew colder. "You faked your death," she said slowly, like she was trying to make sense of a language she didn't speak. "You let me bury you. You let your mother cry over an empty casket. You watched me fall apart. All because you needed to be sure." Daniel reached for her hand. "Maya, please. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to know. I had to." She pulled away. "You didn't have to know anything, Daniel. You had to trust me. And you didn't. So you tortured me instead." She stood up. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I knew, Daniel. I knew you were alive. Someone sent me a message a week after the funeral, an anonymous tip, that you'd been seen at a motel outside the city. At first, I didn't believe it, but then I started noticing things, the cameras you installed, the way certain accounts were still active, and I realized what you'd done." Daniel felt the ground fall out from under him. "You knew? Then why did you keep pretending?" Maya's voice cracked. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted to see if you'd come to your senses and realize how sick this was. But you didn't. You just kept watching. Even when you saw me breaking, you kept watching. And that's when I knew. You don't love me, Daniel. You love control. And I'm done being your experiment." After Maya walked away, Daniel's world collapsed. Within days, the truth about what he'd done started to leak. Someone, maybe Marcus, maybe someone else, tipped off a local journalist. The story exploded. Wealthy tech entrepreneur fakes own death to test fiancé. The headlines were everywhere. Social media tore him apart. People called him manipulative, abusive, psychotic. His business partners distanced themselves. Clients canceled contracts. His mother wouldn't take his calls. Daniel tried to explain himself in a press release, framing it as a mental health crisis, a moment of temporary insanity brought on by past trauma. But no one was buying it. Public sentiment was clear. What he'd done was unforgivable. Maya, meanwhile, stayed silent. She didn't give interviews. She didn't respond to the dozens of media requests. She just went back to work, kept her head down, and tried to rebuild her life. About 6 months later, Daniel ran into Leon at a coffee shop. They hadn't spoken since the story broke. Leon looked at him with something like pity. "You doing okay, man?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know, honestly. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting myself." Leon shook his head. "You weren't protecting yourself, Daniel. You were punishing her for something someone else did to you. And now, you've lost everything, including the one person who actually loved you." Years passed. Daniel moved to another city, started over with a new business, under a different name. He went to therapy, worked on himself, tried to make peace with what he'd done. But there were some things that couldn't be fixed, some wounds that wouldn't heal. He never saw Maya again, but he heard, through mutual friends, that she eventually got married. A quiet ceremony, just family. She was happy, and Daniel was glad for her. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about that moment in the park, the look in her eyes when she told him she'd known all along, and he'd wonder, what if he'd just trusted her? What if he'd just let himself be loved? 3 years after everything fell apart, Daniel received a package in the mail. No return address, just his name written in handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside was a letter. "Daniel, I've thought a lot about what happened between us. For a long time. I was angry. Then I was sad. Now, I'm just tired. I want you to know that I did love you. Truly. But love isn't supposed to feel like a test you're constantly failing. Love isn't surveillance or suspicion or punishment for crimes you didn't commit. I hope you've found peace. I hope you've learned that trust isn't something you demand. It's something you build. And I hope, someday, you find someone who can love the version of you that isn't afraid. Take care of yourself. Maya." Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He never wrote back. About a year later, Daniel was diagnosed with a terminal illness. The prognosis was grim. 6 months, maybe less. As he lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about his life, the successes, the failures, the people he'd hurt. He thought about Maya. In his final days, Daniel wrote his own letter. He addressed it to no one in particular, just his thoughts on paper, a confession of sorts. He wrote about how fear had driven every decision he'd made, how he'd mistaken control for safety, how he'd destroyed the best thing in his life because he couldn't believe he deserved it. He wrote, "I thought love needed proof. But love doesn't need proof. It needs faith, and faith is the one thing I never had." When Daniel died, the letter was found among his belongings. His brother debated whether to send it to Maya, but ultimately decided against it. She'd moved on. She was happy. Why reopen old wounds? So the letter stayed sealed. But Daniel's story didn't. It spread through whispers and retellings, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear dictate your heart. And somewhere, in a house filled with laughter and love, Maya heard about his death. She felt a pang of sadness, not for what was, but for what could have been. If only he'd trusted her. If only he'd let go. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Was Daniel a victim of his own trauma? Or was he responsible for the destruction he caused? Can we ever truly test love? Or does the act of testing destroy the very thing we're trying to prove? Think about your own relationships. Have you ever let fear drive your decisions? Have you ever pushed someone away because you were too afraid to let them in? And if you were in Maya's position, could you have forgiven him? Or would you have walked away, just like she did? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective. Because this story isn't just about Daniel and Maya, it's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when we're scared, and the consequences of those choices. If this story made you think, made you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, ones that make you question, reflect, and feel, subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, the next one is even more intense. Thank you for watching. And remember, love isn't a test. It's a leap of faith. Take care.